Simply securing a research position is only the first step. Now, let's talk about how to make the most of it. There are two components we're going to cover. First, how to impress the PI and do a killer job in the lab. And second, how to most effectively portray your research in your applications and interviews. It's important that you work hard and show your dedication to the lab. The more you do, the more you will receive in return. There are two primary outcomes we are looking for. First, impressing your PI and getting a strong letter of recommendation, and second, securing publications, abstracts, or presentations. In terms of secondary outcomes, there are multiple. We want you to get experience in the world of research so that you can understand whether or not it's something you want to pursue more seriously in the future as a physician scientist. We want you to hone your discipline, inquisitive nature, and comfort in reading the primary literature, also conducting statistical analyses and working with a team. Now let's focus on the two primary outcomes. To impress your PI and to secure a strong letter of recommendation, it comes down to a few key factors. First, always be professional, even from your initial cold emails, as you will be working for them as part of a team. Sometimes it'll be a paid position, sometimes it's going to be volunteering or for course credit, but the dynamic and expectations will be consistent. Second, open, honest, and respectful communication is a must. From the beginning, you should be clear with how much time you are able to commit to the lab. Never overpromise and underdeliver. We want to do the opposite, to underpromise and overdeliver. Which brings us to the third point: initiative and commitment. This comes down to not only the hours spent in lab, but even your effort outside of the lab. Are you reading papers relevant to the subject on your own time and becoming a more valuable member of the team? Are you applying yourself fully in chemistry lab and understanding the principles of various research techniques so you can properly perform them in the lab? Ask not what the PI can do for you, but what you can do for your PI. If you really want to be a superstar and you're comfortable doing so, you can eventually ask to take the lead on one of your own independent projects under their guidance. Fourth, hone your attention to detail. Regardless of whether you're conducting basic science or clinical research, research is not the place to rush and make careless mistakes. Attention to detail and meticulousness is a must. This is an important trait to develop not only now in research, but also as a future physician. By following these principles, your PI will be pleasantly surprised with how much value you're adding to the lab. Later down the road, as you prepare your medical school application, they should be more willing to write you a strong letter of recommendation. And if you're on your PI's good side, they'll also be more likely to view you favorably in decisions about delegating individuals to various projects. By working hard and pulling more than your own weight, you'll also be more likely to be a higher ranked author on a paper, which ultimately strengthens your application. Being first or second author, for example, is much more impressive than being fourth or fifth. All right, now let's focus on optimizing for publications, abstracts, and presentations. As we spoke about in the previous lesson, you want to maximize the number of research items on your application without going for too many weaker publication types. At the very least, you want to be working towards one publication in a peer-reviewed journal that's at the case control level or higher. These studies are far more involved, require greater levels of critical thinking, and are much more worthwhile for you, not only in terms of strengthening your application, but also teaching you about the process of research. If you have the time and ambition, go ahead and take on some other projects too. It's fine to do book chapters or case reports, but don't make these the bulk of your research experience. But don't spread yourself too thin. It's better to do a kick-ass job on one project and impress your PI than it is to do a mediocre job on several projects. When first starting out, you'll be doing simple grunt work assigned to you by your PI. But as you learn the ropes and become more of an independent thinker, you can begin adding value to the team in other ways. For example, you can consider side projects based off of your current project to test derivative hypotheses. If you want to really be hardcore, like I was in medical school, you can even create your own study from scratch. This is much easier to do with something like clinical research built from databases rather than doing bench work. Now, keep in mind, this is a much more advanced technique, but I'll give you a brief rundown right now. First, you decide what database you have access to and what types of questions you can ask. Then go on PubMed and Google Scholar and scour the literature to see if anyone has already conducted a study similar to what you have in mind. At this point, you may have come across similar studies that cause you to revise your hypothesis or what you want to test. Now next, you need to read extensively. You want to read dozens of papers to deeply understand the area that you're focusing on. You don't need to be the world expert on the topic, but you need to understand it deeply if you want to write a paper about it. Now, as I'm reading the papers, I use a reference manager to keep track of where each fact is coming from. I use either Mendeley, which is free, or EndNote, which is paid, but you can often get it for free from your university. Now, I take extensive notes from the papers, and these notes, which have citations on each bullet point, are now the basis from which I begin drafting the introduction to my paper. In terms of actually crunching the numbers, I used SPSS, which was very easy to learn, although you should take a biostatistics class or do extensive reading online to make sure you don't make these common statistical mistakes. There are also other programs you can consider depending on what you have access to, such as R, Stata, and others. Now, after doing all this, you're gonna write out your methods, results, and discussion sections. You now have a rough draft of a paper. Now, the funny thing is I wouldn't even tell people I was doing this. I would just walk in one day and say, hey, I had an idea for a study, so I crunched some numbers and I drafted this. Would you be able to take a look? And if you like it, I'd love to have you as a PI on the study. Now, the attending physician would generally be pleasantly surprised, maybe even a little confused, but they would get back to me shortly thereafter and be very impressed. They loved it. They got a free paper where they didn't even have to do any work, and now they have their name as a PI. Congrats, you just got yourself positioned as first author as well. And the icing on the cake is that you impressed the hell out of them, and they're much more likely to go to bat for you when it's application time. Again, this is a more advanced technique and you don't have to do this. I only began doing this in medical school, not as a pre-med, but I'm including it here for those who really want to be rock stars in the research game. If you do want to take this approach and crush research, then schedule some time with us one-on-one and we'd be happy to guide you through the process. Now let's go back to how to maximize your publications. Anytime you work on a paper, you should be able to submit it as a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, but also submit it for presentation at a conference. The general guideline is that you should only present a single research paper at one national conference and one local or regional conference. It's frowned upon and often explicitly forbidden to present the same research at multiple national conferences, but you'll have to read the details for your specific conference to be sure. To optimize your CV, you actually don't want to use the same title for your paper and for your presentations. If you're able to use slightly different titles, it makes it seem like you have more projects under your belt. You're not lying, and you should definitely never lie on your application. And you can explain that it's the same project if they do ever ask you on the interview, but that rarely ever happens. Similarly, if you had multiple findings from the paper, you can also split it up into multiple smaller abstracts or presentations to again increase the number of research items on your app. As admissions committees are going through hundreds of applications, they're often simply glancing over the CV and getting a gestalt. Trust me, as someone who has reviewed hundreds of applications myself, we simply don't have the time to investigate every single research project. Now, some of you may be uncomfortable about this part. Again, I'm just keeping it real with you and I refuse to dumb it down. These are the strategies used by top applicants and you can use them to optimize your application as well. This is an aspect of the application that usually requires additional finesse and nuance for each individual. We've provided high-yield foundations here, but if you do need additional help, as this is a highly nuanced area that requires different approaches for each student, you can always schedule a free 15-minute consult on medschoolinsiders.com. After optimizing for these two primary outcomes, again, impressing your PI and optimizing publications, abstracts, and presentations, you'll notice multiple beneficial secondary outcomes as well. If it's tough and uncomfortable at first, that's normal. Push through, and you may even be surprised at what you're able to accomplish.